Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ. The Uncommon Good, live from Iowa Catholic Radio's Mercy Live Up Studios.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you live from across these United States. I'm here in Des Moines, Iowa, in the Mercy One studios from Iowa Catholic Radio, where I am the Director of Mission and Ministry at Mercy College of Health Sciences and the Director of the Zeta Institute for Foundation, Ethics, and Leadership. You can find us at mchs.edu and zetainstitute.com. Bud, out there in Pittsburgh, what are you up to?
I'm at the National Institute for Newman Studies, Director here, and our website is newmanstudies.org.
We also have, very kindly, co-host joining us today, Adam Storey from the diocese here in Iowa. So you should self-promote, Adam. Where should people go find you at?
Well, I don't know if I want to be found.
That's right.
No. dmdiocese.org.
That's
you
right.
can, marriage and family life ministry. There's lots of stuff. So
that's fantastic. Adam's joining us today because I'll be honest, I wasn't dead sure I'd make it today. We have kiddo number 5 in the Bonner family that came into the world this past Thursday. So Helena Catherine Rose, thanks everybody for all the prayers and the kind wishes. I am here today, but I do realize that with the sort of lack of sleep that my brain may be the consistency of Jell-O. So I wanted to have someone in studio that if I started speaking utter nonsense, he could at least slap me or at least change the subject. So thank you for joining us in studio, Adam.
Yeah, it's a big job, but I'm going to do my best. So I'll see what I can do.
We appreciate it. And as always, we're brought to you by Cartridge World. So for instance, I'm thinking if I needed Bud to list out all the things that we need to buy for people coming in for Helena's baptism, I could go to Cartridge World and print out a list of supplies, or maybe one of those really old school, self-made cards. Remember when they used to have you can make a happy birthday card with the sort of tractor wheel paper? I'm not going to do that, but I'm guessing you could if you wanted to use Cartridge World.
Yeah, that's right. My thoughts turned to Cartridge World a couple months ago. I was watching, I believe it was the Bills versus the Patriots, and some fan had just printed off a little sheet of paper that said the Patriots are cheaters, which content-wise I was like, well played. But I thought that guy should have gone to Cartridge World because he could have upped the quality of his print game.
Yeah, that's right. So your good message, but the medium is at least part of the message.
Think about the medium.
That's right. And then also brought to Mercy College of Health Sciences. But I have to tell you, one of the craziest things when you have a new baby in a town in which you teach people who are becoming healthcare professionals, we had 7 to 8 different Mercy College graduates that we ran into, and 3 times the night nurse was students that you and I had in class. So
that's crazy. I mean, that's on the one level that's kind of cool to see. And I feel okay about my teaching skills, but there's a part of me that wonders, if I'd ever run into a nurse who's like, I think I'll give this guy a little less anesthesia.
Yeah. Well, luckily it wasn't me, and it was for my wife, but I couldn't have been more proud. It was sort of a ridiculous made-for-TV after-school special where I looked very proud of my wife who, 9 months pregnant, did such a great job, holding our baby, and then having these students who did fantastic care, and it was wonderful to have them. So mchs.edu to go learn more, and maybe you could be my student. I don't know about kids, but I'm obviously going to have health problems, and someday you can help me out.
Well, when we were in high school, I feel like there were a lot of movies about teachers changing lives. So I hope you had a montage at the hospital this week.
That's right. It seemed like a montage because I didn't have a lot of sleep and I kept kind of passing out. So it seemed like a montage.
Well, speaking of Mercy, Bo, I feel like today's show is somewhat maybe a preview for a future faith and healing speaker. I met Brent Robbins here in Pittsburgh, and he teaches psychology at Point Park University. But he's written a really fascinating book called The Medicalized Body and Anesthetic Culture, the Cadaver, the Memorial Body, and the Recovery of Lived Experience. And it gets into a lot of interesting points about, the training that medical students receive, but about our culture as a whole, like how we relate to the dead.
And I think it's interesting to talk about that we go from the human body, the respect of a dead body, to talking about living bodies and then the body politic, all intertwined with the common good. And so, Adam, I think you were a natural to think about coming on the show, not only because you're an Uncommon Good all-star and you've been on,
but also a zombie.
But you are a zombie. We didn't really want to, no. But I don't know. You've had various roles. You've been in the military. You work in marriage and family life. The idea of what is a body, what counts as a body, how do we have a relationship and obligation to bodies, and how does that relate to the body politic? I just think you're a natural to come co-host with us and talk to our guests today.
Yeah, when I saw this topic, and as Bud and I were talking about it, the anesthetic culture, I think, is just a really interesting thing to dive into. And I certainly saw that in the military. When you talk about combat and a really stressful, difficult situation, interacting with other people, how do they make it easier for you to just sort of ignore what's really happening? Ignore what you're really doing. And they have intentional strategies to help you do that. It's a part of your training to avoid the actual experience, or to not think about the actual experience of combat. And so, it's a really interesting topic, and I think it flows out. As we talk about medical studies and things, it's there, but it flows out into our culture in I think a lot of diverse ways. And things we need to think about. Well,
it's going to be a great show. And like we said, we have this topic coming up. We have Adam in the house being a co-host, and you really want to stick around. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back after these messages. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr, our guest co-host today in the studio. Adam Storey from the Diocese of Des Moines. Bud, if you don't mind introducing the guest today for the show.
So our guest this morning is Dr. Brent Robbins. He's chair and professor of psychology at Point Park University and has a Ph.D. in clinical psychology from Duquesne. He's council representative and past president of Division 32 of the American Psychological Association, and he's led the development of a master's and doctorate program in clinical community psychology at Point Park University. His most recent publication is The Medicalized Body and Anesthetic Culture. Brent, thanks for being with us this morning.
Hey, thanks for having me, Bo and Bud. How's it going?
All right, just to warn you, when you're stepping into the octagon this morning, it's not simply a double team. We have a guest host as well, so you're being triple teamed this morning.
Oh, okay. So who's the other person then?
Adam Storey. He's Adam, what's your title at the diocese?
So I'm the Marriage and Family Life Office Director, and that is as intimidating as it sounds, so be ready.
We thought you were going to talk about dead bodies, right? We're like, let's bring in the marriage and family life.
Natural fit, yeah.
Well, Brent, I guess that ties into my first question. I'm sure your family has had to adjust some to you researching about death. I'm curious, what first piqued your interest or got you started down this trail where you were looking at the cadaver, the memorial body, and recovery of lived experience?
Yeah, it was a very, I remember very vividly the moment where I got interested in this. I was reading, I was at that time a graduate student at Duquesne, and I was working in the counseling center, and sometimes you would have clients who don't show up and who are late, and so I would have to kill some time, and usually they had the Chronicle of Education was usually around the office, so I would read that. And one week they had a really interesting article where there was a photo essay by a photojournalist on medical students working with cadavers, and I just was really fascinated by it. And what I was most fascinated by was the interviews. The pictures were beautiful, but also the surprisingly beautiful given the subject matter, but also some of the comments by the students I thought were really interesting, and the things that they were struggling with about the humanity of the cadaver kind of struck me, and I thought were, something that should be further investigated. At that time, I already had a dissertation subject, so I just sort of stuck it in a drawer and forgot about it. And then later, I got my first tenure track position at a place called Damon College in Buffalo, and my first semester there, they had an announcement that they were going to have a guest speaker on campus, and it was the photojournalist from that article, just by coincidence. And I was like, "Whoa, I've got to go see this." And I did, and she was just fantastic. But there was also a panel discussion, which really blew my mind. It was like on the panel they had a couple people who were instructors of anatomy, the gross anatomy course there at the university. They had a donor, a potential who had already donated his body but was still alive. He was going to donate it when he died. They had several students. Some students who are anticipating going into the course and who hadn't had it yet, and then students who had taken it to talk about their experience. And there were some really interesting revelations that came out of that. So that led me down to, immediately after I got out of that, I'm like, I'm going to do a study. I wrote up a proposal and got a student to help me, and we started doing the study that eventually led to my book.
Well, I think it's timely to hear about how it was personal bodies sitting there speaking, right, that showed up in multiple places, right, in print before you had the chance to talk to them, that lent you down this path. I know this seems like it's off, sort of out of left field, but when I was thinking about today, I was thinking about yesterday. I was teaching some students about the difference between speaking out loud and then writing a paper. And I go, why do they seem so radically different? And what I started to point out, right, is like when you're talking and you can see a human face, psychologically you act a lot different than if you have to invent the person that you're reading about. Now, this might all sound completely not related to our topic, except I think that when it comes to a cadaver, this is sort of the psychological aspect of humans beholding each other and trying to figure out what does it mean to deal with a person other than ourselves, either as an object or a subject. It sort of boils it all down to its most basic existential point. How will we treat each other when we're dead? And the person that you're beholding, who has a human face, can't, so to speak, look back at you. And I wonder if in your studies in sort of interacting with this, do you see that kind of being something that comes up, is how we treat the human body is sort of at the very base foundation of how we're going to treat people otherwise in different situations?
Yeah, wow. I think you just nailed the really central point of the entire book. That was actually really beautifully said. I think that's really gets at the heart of what I discovered in the process of this inquiry. I didn't know that at the beginning that that's what I was looking for, but that's what I found. So at the beginning, I was just interested in how do medical students cope with dealing with the dead and dying on a daily basis? How does it trigger their own death anxiety, and how do they cope with that? But what I ended up discovering was that they were talking a lot about, not so much about their own death and their anxieties about death, but their sort of trepidation or their ambivalence about what they were doing to this body of this other person when they were doing the dissection. And that eventually led me to look at it from a more cultural, historical perspective, and I started to see a historical correlation between cultures and societies that can be very dehumanizing, what I call an aesthetic kind of consciousness, a kind of callousness, you might say, toward other people that can be linked to violence and dehumanization of others, and the way those people tend to understand and treat the dead. And I think that there seems to be a correlation between the two. And I found that when medical students were working with bodies in the cadaver lab, that when you start to just listen to what students are saying, what they're struggling with, that starts to make sense. It's like when they see somebody's face, or when they see what they call a more personal aspect of the body, like the face or the hands, was another aspect of the body that really reminded a person of called the person to consider the personhood of the body. Then they really struggled with going forward with the process of dissection, and students had different ways of coping with that. Some of them were just disgusted by the process and couldn't even go forward with it at all. Some students had to just forget that this was a person and think of it as a fascinating machine and sort of continue on thinking about it as a mechanism. And but there was a few students that I was really impressed with who were able to hold those two together, to be able to work with the body as a physical organism, and at the same time maintain a kind of relationship to the person which I think is you're very right about how it's similar to, it takes a kind of imaginative act to participate in that relationship because the person isn't responding. And so a lot of times the person would come up with a name, a backstory about their cadaver, and that wasn't just arbitrary. They would use the body, signs in the body, to give them clues about what kind of life this person had lived and maybe what kind of relationships they had. There'd be signs, for example, if the person had previous pregnancies or maybe a cesarean section, or, so, okay, this is somebody who has children, or maybe, I remember somebody talking about the adipose tissue around the neck and how that led to that, how she would literally in her mind have conversations with her cadaver about, gee, how did your neck end up this way? Is this just your genetics, or was there something about your diet? And this wasn't just an abstract philosophical or, exercise or cognitive exercise. It felt like it was a conversation for her with her cadaver. The cadavers would also show up in the dreams of patients, especially at pivotal moments. Like there was a point when the cadaver would be flipped over from the belly onto the back, and that was a time when a lot of the students would describe a lot of anxiety, but also these very vivid dreams. One dream, the person dreamed that their cadaver had sort of come alive and was walking towards them and then tore off their own head and handed it to them.
Wow.
So there was some pretty powerful stuff there.
Brent, you mentioned just the historical correlation that you found in other cultures or previous cultures, and I'm wondering, do you have any stories or any practices that you saw that you felt were like a really healthy way of relating to mortality and relating to death?
In the book, a couple of I focused in particular on the dissection of, a couple of different periods of time prior to Vesalius. So usually Vesalius is considered to be sort of the birth of modern anatomy with the publication of On the Fabric of the Human Body. That was 1543. But people had been dissecting cadavers in bodies for a long time prior to that, actually, several hundred years. And there had been autopsies that were being done. So a lot of people have this misconception. There's this myth that the church condemned autopsy or dissection of bodies, and actually that isn't true. It was being conducted, as early as the 13th century.
Wait, and side note, by the way, I love when people say that, where I'm like, there are literally bones of people in like every church I've ever been to. So
right.
I don't know where you're hitting this, but sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So there's a lot of course, myths, as you know, about the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, and all that stuff. This is just another example of that. But it was actually 1286. It was actually one of the first reported forensic autopsies. And what's interesting about that is it was commissioned by the husband for the wife. So it was a loving act. And the main reason that he wanted the autopsy done by a physician was to identify the cause of death. And the purpose of that was to try to understand how his children could possibly be affected. I mean, they hadn't yet discovered genetics, but they had some sense that it seemed like certain kinds of diseases could be inherited, even though they didn't know the mechanism. So he wanted to know if this was something that was likely to affect his kids. And so there I think you have a case where there's a dissection of a person done out of love, respect, care for her, but also care for his children. 1318 and 1320, I think, are a fascinating period that I focus on in the book, where you have a period of time where female prospective saints were being dissected. Chiara of Montefalco, Margherita of Città di Castello were dissected. Chiara's story is really fascinating because when she died, she was dissected by the nuns that she was living with, and they were looking for signs of sainthood in her body, right, as evidence for her canonization to sainthood. And what's fascinating is they did discover things, reportedly.
Uh-oh. I think we lost him.
It was on a fascinating point, too.
That's right.
But, no, I think, Bo, with what Dr. Robbins was talking about, as Catholics, and this has come up on the show before, like our relationship to the dead is not incidental to the faith, right?
Right.
Like,
Well, and I think part of it is to say one of the things people will sort of shorthand this and say, "Oh, the Catholic Church is about both and," which is sort of a really simplistic way to say that there's a real participatory way in which what happens to us as individuals has ramifications for us as a community. And so when you say that there's these events in life where we go, like, this is a very central idea about how we look at each other, that it can't help but have ramifications for the whole society. And so, like Adam, we were talking about before the show, what you're going to do when you perceive a dead body is going to say what we generally think about the reverence that a human being is due in society at large. In various ways, the different positions you've held, do you see that sort of outcroppings in your ministry or other aspects of your life?
Yeah, I do. And I think, one of the things that Dr. Robbins said that I thought was interesting, he talked about those people who are able to interact with cadavers, he said, in a really healthy way. He talked about what he saw as an imaginative act, trying to come up with a backstory and understand who this person was. And I think that flows out in a lot of different ways. I would say one of the real struggles in our culture is this lack or unhealthy imaginative practices, or a lack of it, a lack of imagination that really cripples us. And so yeah, I definitely think it flows out in lots of different ways.
Well, guys, I was thinking. Go ahead, Bo.
Yeah, I was just saying. I know that we were joking around about marriage life and stuff, but I think that it would, like, something like death does affect how we view something like marriage. Now, as it turns out, the line, sorry for the pun, died, but we got him back.
All right.
All right. Are you there, Brent? Because we were all really interested in the point you were about to make, and you were like, they did find signs of sainthood, blank line. so let's try it again and see if the phone companies.
Yeah, because all I know is I just kept blabbering on with no idea that I'd been disconnected.
It was the worst possible moment. Like, I'm still on the edge of my seat.
Yeah. So
all right. Okay, so Claire of Montefalco, they found a number of signs of sainthood in her body, one of which is a crucifix found in her heart tissue, which you can still see on display in a reliquary.
Wow.
And
wow.
Yeah, in Marguerite di Castello, they found 3 stones that they found in her heart, which they believe were a reflection of the Trinity. So in general, what you see, I think, with these incidents is the view of the feminine body as receptive and impressionable to spiritual forces. That when the body dies, and it's a very Trinitarian understanding of the body, right? When a person is part of the church and participating in the sacraments, that grace infuses the body, transforms the body, and actually leaves signs of holiness within the body. So the body is a sacred body infused by grace. And that view of the body really begins to shift when you get to Vesalius, where there's almost an aggressive, intentional move to strip medicine of any hint of that view of the body.
Yep. We didn't go dead this time either. We want to reassure you. We were just really fascinated. Before the break comes up, when you start to, for some folks, maybe that might be very helpful. Like, we'll get this back on track. We'll get back after the break and get deep into the theology of it again. Yeah. Can you give just a brief timeline? So we got the Middle Ages. Can you sort of finish that up to now, right? So, like, what are some of the sort of advances that bring us to modern cadavers, and then when we get back from the break, we'll re-dive into the philosophical.
Let me give you some time points. So, 1286, you had the first forensic autopsy commissioned by a husband to identify the cause of death. Then, not very long after that, in 1318 and 1320. Respectively, you have the dissection of Chiara of Montefalco and Margherita of Sita di Castello. And then after that, you begin to see the transformation of the sacred body to the what I call the desacralized body. So 1316, you see the first account of a medical dissection, but it's particularly around the mid-14th century that I think is a very important pivotal moment, because you have cadaver dissections that are required for a doctorate in northern Italy in medical schools. And shortly after that, because of the demands for cadavers and the lack of donors, they start to use criminals who had been executed. And I think it's especially important that the judges, when they condemn the person to die and to be dissected as a cadaver, that the dissection was seen as an extension of the punishment. It was seen as something that would be stigmatizing and humiliating to the person. And so they also had a rule that it had to be a stranger. It had to be somebody who was being dissected, had to be from at least 100 miles away from where the dissection was being done.
Oh, wow.
Clearly concerned that somebody might recognize the person, right? So the person's humiliated, dissected, but has to be a stranger. And I think you put that together and you see a shift, a very different kind of relationship to the cadaver. Earlier on, husband or commissioning an autopsy of his wife, nuns doing a sort of loving act of dissecting their sister in order to make a case for her canonization. And then in medical school, this very stigmatized body where the very act of their inquiry is itself a kind of symbolic violence against the person that they're working on.
Well,
I think that's very important to the shift that happens at that time.
Yeah, no, and we're coming up on the break, and that is a perfect note to leave that off. We stop there. When we get back from the break, we'll really talk about how we get to the modern world, and like you said, that anesthetized body, and what does that mean? This has been a fantastic talk. Thank you for joining us, Brent, and stick around. Folks, if you're listening, more of that when we get back. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back after these messages. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, our guest co-host today, Adam Storey, who's in the studio with us. Hey, Bud, can you reintroduce our guest for today?
Yeah, our guest this morning is Dr. Brent Robbins, who's the chair of psychology at Point Park University. He has a PhD in clinical psychology from Duquesne University and recently published The Medicalized Body in Anesthetic Culture. Brent, thanks for being back with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, Brent, so when we let you go last before we had our break, you really gave us a timeline, the beginning of sort of forensic dealing with people as cadavers in the West, and the sort of beginnings of the Middle Ages in a sort of personalized manner for why that happened, and then the sort of shift in the sort of the medical field into the body as to shorthand it, an object to be studied or even used for science as a punishment. And so this sort of opens us up towards the modern world in which we live today and how we understand cadavers as dead bodies. I was talking to Adam over the break, and I think he has an interesting angle that I wanted him to go ahead and ask you and see if that can get us the ball rolling in talking about the modern state of cadavers. So, Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, so and in my experience, I have no medical background, but I spent some time in the military, and as we were preparing for this show, it made me think about the way that in the military I saw people interact with bodies, and the way that you talked about the extension of punishment. Like, I could see, in Iraq, that if it's an enemy combatant's body, there wasn't the respect or the reverence in the way that it was an American's body. This is one of our brothers, and this person would be still treated as a person, but an enemy combatant, it was very different. And it made me think about, like, it's not really in the interacting with the body. I didn't see it as a denial of that person's humanity. I think your word, the anesthetic culture, speaks to me about it's sort of a way of, we acknowledge the humanity, but we just try to whitewash it or try to avoid thinking about it too much, or try to dull the point of that. And so I was hoping you'd speak a little bit about that, or, is that kind of the same impulse that you saw in medicine too, a sort of blunting of the humanity of the body?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was the really interesting revelation that came out of my research that I did, over a decade ago now, when I first started doing this research, that I saw, it was very, very clear in my data that, and in my observations, both, I was in the cadaver lab doing ethnographic, observations, and also I was reading diary entries, by students about their experiences, and it was evident from both sources of evidence that the students were really perceived the personhood of the cadaver. The term that I used was, I talk about, there's the cadaver, but there's also this other kind of body, right? I call it the memorial body. Mm-hmm. So you think about it, when you go to a funeral, that's a memorial body. You're meant to think about the body as a person. You're meant to recollect that person's mm-hmm. life, even kneel down and pray, and even maybe have a conversation with the deceased in some way right. in prayer. And there's a relationship to the cadaver, and it's set up that way. The personal affects surround the person. They're dressed in clothes that should be, familiar to that person. They're surrounded by pictures and loved ones, and the person's face and hands are prominently displayed. So all of that sort of makes you sets it up so that you see the person as what I call memorial body, as a person. In contrast, in a cadaver lab, they typically start dissection on the back, and so the person is lying on their stomach. The head and the hands and the feet are covered up, and it's only a small part of the back that is being dissected. So it's very easy to dissociate yourself from the act, to forget what you're actually mm-hmm. doing because of the way it's set up visually and tactily. And so the students, that's why there's this moment of revelation where they're first going to turn their cadaver from the stomach onto their back was really, as you can imagine, pretty anxiety-provoking. Some of them worried that they might actually recognize their cadaver. That might turn out to be, somebody, that cashier that, they saw at the shop every day, when they stopped to buy milk or something like that. So there was anxiety about that. But also and that wasn't something that was just happened when they literally saw the face. It was something they were anticipating the whole time, well before that happened. But they were especially prone to see the personhood of the cadaver when they would come across something that reminded them of their personhood. So maybe it was a tattoo, or maybe it was somebody mentioned nail polish on the nails. There may be something that triggers for them a recollection of the person, and that body, that fascinating machine, that organism that they're working with becomes a person to them. And so I think that's true no matter what kind of body you're dealing with. I mean, I have no doubt in my mind that Vesalius, working with his bodies on some level, was struggling with that perception of the body as a person, but had to very aggressively and assertively forget about that in order to see the body as a machine.
So this makes me think of two things that, again, might sound unrelated, but I think it's definitely going on with what you're talking about. So I think about like the old philosophical school of existentialism, and then I think about a sort of newer field in psychology called human factors. And what I mean by this is, so existentialism, almost always you think of like a mean French person smoking a cigarette. And this is like a horrible version of it. But existentialism, in a sort of like, I see newer people reinvestigating the field, which is essentially asking about the comportment one has towards reality, right? So like, how do I situate myself in a life that I find myself in? Human mm-hmm. factors is, and I'm probably preaching to the choir with you, but for the viewers, listeners who might not know, human factors is sort of an applied psychological field where they deal with things like where should you put like the start button on a machine? Where's the best place to put a doorknob for a handle? Where should, if you're making an airplane and you have like 1,000 buttons, what's the best place to put them because of how human psychology will easily find them? But then it starts getting into weird things like, why do humans view certain room setups as reverent and other ones as not, right? Are there colors that make us... And so what you start to realize, right, is existentialism is not just like I'm sipping cappuccino with a cigarette in Paris thinking about like what is life and death. Existentialism also has to be like, how do we set up the life we live in to comport ourselves in this life in a very practical way? It's an existential question to say, where do you put the doorknob? Because people will deal with a door different depending on where the doorknob is. when it comes to the dead and what you've said so far about like how there's the memorial body, the desacralized body, that like people might seem that sound weird. You're like, what, you're multiplying bodies? How can one body be multiple bodies? I think it's actually this sort of like existential human factors thing, right? Like we make decisions about how to organize space around the dead, and to do that makes the living live very different lives. And I think that starts to be where we can make a lot of hay about our current culture, looking at how they treat the dead. Why? Because people might go, how do you know these individuals fear death just because of how they deal with these bodies? And you're like, we make decisions about how to organize space around dead bodies that make us interact with them different. I mean, is that another thing? I mean, is that a fair extrapolation on my part based on the research that you've been doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you nailed it. Yeah, I mean, existential thought is very informative to my own work. I draw a lot upon Ernest Becker's work, for example, in Denial of Death, so that there's a certain sense in which I'm playing with the idea. Usually, what I hear a lot from my colleagues in psychology is this sort of default sort of secularism and naturalism. This kind of naturalism is the default view where, oh, well, if people don't have a naturalistic view, that's a kind of a denial of death. Well, I'm kind of flipping the script here a little bit and saying that actually a kind of mechanistic, reductive, naturalistic view is a kind of denial of death.
Amen.
When you see the body as a mere mechanism, and you see that as somehow a more realistic or somehow sober or dispassionate view of the body, what my research shows is actually it requires a very active, very aggressive suppression of our very natural perception of that dead person as a person.
And you put a cadaver in a very antiseptic space. I'm starting to realize this, right? Like you no cadaver lab is ornate or intimate. And you start to go, oh, they're worried about that. Like if you make a cadaver lab a little too comfortable as if you're spending time with a person, that's going to change what you're doing to that body. And so you need the space to be, like you said, antiseptic, naturalistic. It's like, how abstract can we make a concrete relation be organized in space?
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put. Yeah, the space of the lab is set up in such a way that the background context almost demands from you to see the body as a mechanism. Yeah. And you contrast that with a funeral parlor, and you can, as a background, and you get a very different perception or experience of the body. And that's really the difference between the memorial body and the cadaver is not really, they're the same body. It's what gets disclosed, what gets revealed about the body in the particular environmental context, in the background of its setting. And the human factors context there is very important. And then how we set those kinds of how we set up those kinds of relationships in our environments influence how we behave, influence how we think, influence what we do, and how we relate to one another. And when we set up conditions where we're really distancing ourselves from death, and this will come around to another important point in the book, when we set it up where we start to distance ourselves from death and dying, then it becomes very easy to become sort of forgetful of, the transcendent, the part of ourselves that is that exists beyond the realm that we can see and hear and taste and reduced to, predictable, empirical, mechanistic observations. And you can see where that sets up the conditions where it becomes very easy, maybe even the default position, to take a kind of, secular humanism or a kind of atheistic viewpoint that we're seeing becoming more dominant today.
Yeah, and Brent, I hope this question isn't too far afield. Like in a show about the common good, as we think about the ways that our culture increasingly pushes, like those who are dying, and the reality of death to the margins, how has this impacted the way you think about, like, as a community of faith, like how do we foster practices that deal in a more truthful, in a better way with death, or has this even impacted the way you plan for your own final resting and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's an interesting part of this story is that I had a contract to write this book, and had already begun to write the book. And just a few months after that, my father got sick, and had a very rapid decline from a mysterious brain disease. And as I was writing this book, I was also, spending time by his side as he was in the process of dying, and we had to make those kinds of decisions about what was going to be his, what was going to happen at his funeral, how his burial and all those kinds of things. And so it made the writing of the book especially meaningful to me because we were struggling with those questions as a family. And ultimately, it seemed to me that a lot of the things that I never really understood that just seemed kind of nitpicky to me about the church's teachings began to make a lot of sense. So the idea that, it's important when you bury somebody that they're buried in a particular location. Maybe it's in a mausoleum, maybe it's in the ground, but there's an identifiable marker. The person's not just sort of cast to the wind somewhere, like cremated and maybe thrown into a river or something like that the person loved to fish in. And I think I understand the sentiment behind that, but I think that when it's important, even psychologically, to be able to have a place that you can go to. I mean, for me, I go now, my father's been passed away now for a year and a half, going on 2 years, coming up on the 2nd year anniversary of his death. And I still at least once a month go out to the cemetery, usually more often. And, I replace the flowers. I, see how, pick up the weeds or, pick the weeds or whatever other problems that might be around the cemetery. I visit his new friends. There's always new people being buried. And
right.
I look up who it was. I read their obituaries. It's like they're now almost like they're part of the family because they're there with my father. Yeah. And I occasionally hope that when I go to the cemetery, I'll bump into a family member. Somebody who had recently died. I get to meet them because you don't often get a chance to do that. But it's really meaningful to go to the gravesite and even to remember the state that he was in his funeral at the time and how he's been buried and now he's going through a process. I was even thinking about the first year, understanding sort of the process of the decay and how the person the body begins to break down, and how that's really, it's to me kind of symbolic of a process of coming to terms with his death psychologically is mirrored in what's happening with the body as it's beginning to disintegrate. And how I'm sort of being able to sort of, move on with my life, and have a life without my father, but how he's always still a part of my life. And all that, I think, is something that I think would have been much harder to do, speaking very personally, if I hadn't had a place to go to visit him. His body.
I can tell you, nothing is more countercultural than like raising kids in this era to be like cool with death. I mean, we've just always stopped by cemeteries and had the kids pray for the dead. That's something growing up not Catholic, evangelical, that just didn't happen. And so to do that, like every city we go to, the kids are always like, "Where's the cemetery?" And for them to go up to and talk to like adults, like Generation X or above, and just start rattling on like, "Hey, when did this person die? When do you think you'll die?" And like I'm always like, "Oh gosh," that really strikes people as this very different thing. So. I was thinking that like maybe what we can draw from this in very practical terms is the church. We have a laundry list of things that the church can do better, but certainly this seems like one. And since we have an employee of the diocese here, Brent, let me let me interpret this for you. Adam should have another job added to his workload, correct? So you should do marriage, family life, and death.
This seems to be how most of these shows end. You come up with another obligation.
Bishop Pates puts us up to this, Adam.
Yeah, I believe that, I think that's probably true.
But, Brent, to that point, I think, I know that there's been some work in this. People here in the Diocese of Des Moines have talked about, are we going to do a better job of talking about, advanced directives or talking to people about don't let, death sneak up on you. How do you want to leave a legacy? Things like this. But the sort of deep psychological and societal level by which we understand bodies It's not polite company talk still to this day, probably because of what Bud was getting at about, the death-denying aspect of our culture. So we have about 2 minutes left, but do you think that that's something that your research says that we need to do better as a church, is be able to have people understand the medical body, the memorial body, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's really important. It has very practical implications. Something that I didn't get a chance to mention that I talk a lot about in my book is, between 1854 and 1865, there were 4 major cemeteries built in San Francisco that, because of all these people that came in with the gold rush and then died. And within 50 years later, I think it was in 1901, turn of the 20th century, San Francisco created a city statute that no dead were allowed to be buried in the city limits. The dead that were buried there were removed to a town south of Colma. And I find that very, very poignant, very symbolic.
Joseph Bottom puts this in one of his essays. Yeah, that's crazy. Go ahead, sorry.
So you have an American city, the quintessential American city, the place where people are going for the gold rush, right? So you see the symbol of kind of the new consumerism and materialism. And along with that, this says, okay, there's no place for the dead in this world, right? They have to be removed. And I think that if you look at the way the cities are structured today, cemeteries are they're removed from the city, right? And we still have cemeteries around, like I'm in Pittsburgh, we still have cemeteries in the city, but most of the newer cemeteries are far away outside the city limits, out of sight, right? Compare that to the towns in the Middle Ages, medieval European town, where the cemetery would be at the center of the town with the cathedral. So the orientation of the visual orientation was towards God, the cathedral, and the dead, right, in the place of the dead, which is where our future resides.
Brent,
I think our relationship to dead changes as our cities changed. Yeah.
So sorry about that. As is the experience with a lot of guests of our shows, I feel like we could go another hour with this. So we're going to have you back on in the future. But I just wanted to thank you again for being with us and encourage our listeners to look for Brent's book, The Medicalized Body and Aesthetic Culture. Thanks so much, Brent.
Oh, thank you for having me, Bo and Bud and Adam. Take care. Have a good one.
Well, like I said, we're ending up here. So, Adam, I want to thank you for co-hosting and helping us out.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Bud, thank you for everything, and thanks for all the prayers and well wishes my family received, like I said, with the new baby who came along. So this is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, in our families, our city, our state, our nation, the world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. The Uncommon Good will be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.